Everyone. Welcome to another episode of Confabulating. We're absolutely delighted to be joined tonight by Juan Manuel Rubio Arevalo of the Central European University, who will be delivering a talk entitled "This is the Will of Allah: Simulating the Crusades in Ancestors' Legacy." Juan is a PhD candidate at the Department of Medieval Studies at the Central European University in Vienna. He has an MA in History from the Universidad de Los Andes in Bogota, Colombia, and an MA in Medieval Studies from CEU. He has been a history teacher for over 10 years, both in secondary and higher education. He's taught courses at the Universidad de Los Andes in Bogota, Colombia, at the Institute of Technology and Higher Studies in Monterrey, Mexico, at the University of Debrecen and Hungary as well. He's currently a teaching fellow for the Global History Lab project at Princeton University and the Open Society University Network. His research focuses on the use of crusading medievalisms in contemporary video games from a ludonarrative and pedagogical perspective, with a growing social context of political weaponization of the past. He's also a lead organizer of Medievalisms on the Screen project at CEU. Juan, it's amazing to have you with us this evening. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, again, thank you very much for inviting me. I'll share my screen so we can get going with this. So I hope you can all see it. Is it working? Yeah. Great. Okay. So again, thank you very much for inviting me. Today, I want to share a little bit of what I do for my doctoral research, and I want to expose the case of one particular video game that I've been working on lately that is called Ancestors' Legacy. Maybe first a little bit of the inspiration behind my dissertation, which comes from a very personal experience, and it's that I think that we as historians, we are very much aware that most people today do not interact with history outside of primary and secondary education. When they interact with history, they don't do it through academic means, right? Most people do not learn their history after they leave high school through academic papers or through academic books. Maybe they do it through museums, but outside of museums, it's really through media. You call it your historical films, your historical novels, TV series, social media, YouTube, and more video games. This is not new. For example, Jacques Le Goff, many years ago, when he was interviewed as to why he got interested in the Middle Ages, he confessed that the reason was that when he was younger, he had read Ivanhoe, the 19th century novel by Sir Walter Scott. So this is not a new phenomenon. And in my personal experience, my very first encounter with history was with Age of Empires. And the first thing that I learned about history was through Age of Empires. Of course, when then I got into university, I learned that many of the things that I thought were correct were actually wrong. And hence, my interest on how do video games interact with the past, what do they do, and what are some of the implications that these have. Today, I want to focus on a particular case, and it's the case of Ancestors' Legacy, which is a real-time strategy game very similar to Age of Empires, your top-view, drag-and-click type of RTS, like Age of Empires or like Warcraft. The game was developed by a Polish studio called Destructive Creations, and it came out in 2018. As any other RTS, the game is very similar to other titles like Age of Empires. So you control your base, you secure some resources, recruit soldiers, and defeat your enemies through military means. As in Age of Empires, the game also has a single-player mode, which is set on a series of episode-driven campaigns around specific historical characters. All warriors, all male warriors and kings from the Middle Ages, which cover roughly in the game the earliest is like from the 9th century, and the latest one is around the 13th century. It's like that's the period in which the game is set. Now, the Middle Ages that Ancestors' Legacy portrays is one that is also very common to see in media, right? So it's your gritty Middle Ages, really violent, religiously intolerant, bloody, racially homogeneous, hyper-masculine that you see in recent production like The Northman is the one that comes mostly to mind, a movie that came out last year. So in that, the game is not necessarily unique, right? You can see this type of medievalisms in other forms of representations. What I find interesting particularly is the history of Destructive Creations, because this is a studio that has that has a record of problematic relations with far right-wing ideas. Now, various authors have noted how gaming has become something of a special space for the spread and recruitment by right-wing movements among gamers. And in the case of destructive creations, it's interesting because these ideas, you can see how it filters into their video games. Ancestors Legacy is not the first game that they developed. They first developed another game called IS Defense, which is, I'm going to talk a little bit later about it, which is basically a turret defense against ISIS soldiers invading Europe. So you can see this record of destructive creations flirting with right-wing ideas. And again, this is not new. There is information about this online. There is actually a particular site called Keinen Pixel dem Faschismus. It's a German initiative by game developers, media scholars that seek to promote inclusive spaces in gaming, and they have a whole dossier about destructive creations, if anybody is interested in looking into it. So what I want to do today is analyze how Ancestors Legacy represents the Crusades. And the way in which I'm going to do this is by keeping in mind various elements. First, medievalisms and the special historiographical nature of the Middle Ages, how far right-wing ideologies use the Middle Ages today, some key elements from historical game studies, and destructive creations record, which again is specifically particular in this sense. So when the Middle Ages is a particularly special historiographical period when we think about it, right? There are a lot of imaginaries around the Middle Ages, to the point that medievalisms, this idea of the various images that we have about the period, are in themselves an area of study. Now, all history is representational. All history is just an approximation that we can do to the past with the sources that we have available to us. But the Middle Ages is special because of the many images, often contradictory images, that we associate with it. The Middle Ages is something like this alterity, this space of alterity in which we place everything that we assume is not present in our modern society, be it for better or for worse. And this is from the very inception of the period. Petrarch, already in the 14th century, talked about the Dark Ages in compared to the classical period that he loved so much. During the Reformation and in the 18th century, those writers that sought to critique the institution like the Catholic Church or the nobility used the Middle Ages as a tool to critique their own societies. A good example of this is the Iure Prima Noctis, the supposed right of feudal lords to sleep with their wives of their vassals on their first night, which is a historiographical myth. That's a consensus among historians today, but it's still, for example, very present in many of the narratives that we have today about the Middle Ages. Now, of course, we also know that the Middle Ages have a more romantic side attached to them, which was rescued during the 19th century as a reaction to the coming of capitalism and industry, and also as the birthplace of national ideas. This is the case of the stories of the Grimm brothers, right? The Middle Ages as the birthplace of the nation. Think about Wagner, who is rescuing all these folkloric medieval tales to see in them the birth of the German nation. And also during this romantic period is where many of the ideas of the chivalric knight that we have today is also rescued, and is something that survives until today. So the thing is that when we talk about the Middle Ages, we have a lot of imaginaries attached to it that are the result of this very long historiographical tradition, right? The dark Middle Ages and the romantic Middle Ages. But something important to keep in mind is that here we are not talking about the division between popular history and academic history. It's not like we say that there is this thing, academic history, that was always quote unquote serious when approaching the Middle Ages, and something called popular history. No, they more often than not feed into one another. When professional historians appeared in the 19th century and they approached the Middle Ages in the first place, they were doing it also with the political idea of finding the nation there. So it's something that feeds into one another. And the Crusades are a very good example of this, because the historiographical legacy of the Crusades is very similar to that of the Middle Ages. to the Middle Ages in general. Yeah, so in the Middle Ages, they were a key cornerstone of Christianity with, for example, Robert the Monk, one of our sources for the First Crusade, calling the fall of Jerusalem the most miraculous event since the incarnation of Christ, then being harshly criticized by reformer writers and by the philosophers of the 18th century, either as the manipulation of naive Christians or the manifestation of this intolerant Middle Ages, and then rescued again in the 19th century under the romantic idea of the chivalrous knight who fights for God in faraway lands, a proto-colonialist to some extent, right? Now, of course, our most recent images of the Middle Ages come from after the Second World War, in which the Crusades became again very much criticized under again the legitimation of the colonialist model, right? With Runciman, for example, with his famous 1953 volume, calling it a sin against the Holy Spirit. Most recently, however, our understanding of the Crusades have mostly been shaped by the War on Terror. The attacks on New York and Washington on the 11th of September of 2001 launched this global war on the War on Terror, and many images of the Crusades came back in the 21st century. We all know the famous gaffe by George Bush, I think it was on the 16th of September, when he said, this war on terror, this crusade is going to take a while, that although his PR team was very quickly to try to minimize the damage, the tone was already there. And you can see that, for example, in many of the cultural productions of the period. Think about a movie like Kingdom of Heaven, the 2005 movie, right? That is very much a criticism of the war on terror and no religious violence, but the implicit claim is that it sees the Crusades as equal to the war on terror. Assassin's Creed, which is a game that came out in 2006, does exactly the same thing. Now, of course, this was not only in the West. Islamist movements have a long tradition of associating Western intervention in the region with the Crusades. Already Osama bin Laden talked about Crusaders equating the American presence in Saudi Arabia to the Crusades in the 1990s. And particularly ISIS, with its magazine Davik, used a lot of Crusader narrative, which you can see there, the fourth issue, The Failed Crusade, which is very telling of how they saw the confrontation between the West and the Muslim world. Davik itself, the name of the magazine, has a lot of civilizational conflict elements, because in the Muslim tradition, Davik is a Syrian town in which supposedly the apocalyptic battle between the Caliphate and the Roman Empire is going to take place. So again, we see both this in the Islamist world and in the Western world. In the last few years, and as a consequence of the war on terror and most recently the refugee crisis that developed in 2015, it has really been the alt-right in the Western world who have adopted the Crusades as something of a symbol for themselves. The best example of this, or one of the best examples, is Brenton Tarrant, the mass shooter of Christchurch in 2019. He wrote a manifesto called The Great Replacement Towards a New Society. And in one part of his text, he sends a letter that it says to the Christians. And what he says, I'm not going to read it, is this quotation that you can see in the slide. He says he reproduces a version of Urban II's speech at the Council of Clermont in 1095. Now, I'm going to say something. I'm not sure what is the source that he's using, because this version of the speech does not match any of the contemporary sources of the First Crusade. It doesn't match Robert the Monk or Raymond of Aguilers or Baldric of Dole. It doesn't match any, so I'm not sure what is the source that he's using. But because of the language, it is clear that he seems to be reproducing a source. And just the fact that he's using a papal speech of the First Crusade to justify his attack on his local Muslim community says a lot on how this person is seeing the relationship between the West, Islam, in a long historiographical tradition, right? He sees it as a long-lasting civilizational conflict in which the Crusades and the War on Terror are just a small fraction. Of course, he is not the only case. We saw Crusader crosses, for example, in Charlottesville in 2016 in the United States. We saw Crusader crosses in January 6th in the attack on the Capitol in Washington. And interestingly, it's not only in the global north. You can also find examples of crusading rhetoric in the global south by far-right movements. A Brazilian scholar, Luis Anchieta Guerra, he has written a paper on how Bolsonaro followers use Crusader and medievalist rhetoric to call on a crusade against cultural Marxists and multiculturalism and woke ideology. And even in my own country, and I was very surprised to find this, in Colombia, we had an election last year and we had the first left-wing president in the history of our country. And a group of Catholics created a resistance group called Crusade Cultural Center, again, to fight Marxism and Bolshevism, which is, again, is also interesting, right? Because these are countries that do not have any relationship with the Middle Ages or with the Crusades, and they use Crusading rhetoric, in this case, not against Islam, but against what we could call the broader left, I guess. So as a first idea, it is important to say that the Crusades, at least it seems that for the far right, is like this phenomenon, again, a place of alterity, something that has been lost, but is this form of romantic endeavor to defend Europe or Christianity or traditional values or racial homogeneity from whatever they seem as being threatened by multiculturalism, left-leaning ideas, social equality, etc. Now, where does destructive creations fall into all of this? As I mentioned, it is a Polish studio, which has a record of members of its developer team, including the CEO of the company, of flirting or being openly supportive of far right-wing ideologies. This first came into the light in 2014, when the game developed its first game called Hatred, which is a very stupid game, to be very honest. The premise of the game is that, and if you see the slide, is this guy here in the back with the weapon. That's actually not a member of the developer team. He's just a figure for the marketing of the game. Is that you're this young man dressed in a long trench coat. He doesn't have a name. He's just the quote-unquote antagonist. And the premise is that he's sick of the world. He's going to grab a lot of weapons and he's going to go on a killing spree. It's literally a mass shooter simulator, which, when you think about it, of how the right wing has actually been using mass shootings, is a little bit disturbing that they developed this type of game. When the game fell into its own polemics because of the type of game that it is, a lot of accusations and a lot of the online activity of members of Destructive Creations came into light, in which they flirted and openly supported far right-wing ideologies. Now, at the time, members of the developer team defended themselves first by claiming that they have the right to free speech and that they can like any Facebook group that they want, and also by claiming that they rejected Nazism because members of their families were killed during World War II. Whatever they say, the truth is that some of their ideology, I mean, you can see their ideologies filtering into their games. And the best example of this is IS Defense. IS Defense is a game that came out in 2016, and it's a turret game in which you are a NATO soldier and you have to defend the shores of Europe from an invasion by ISIS. So in their fictional world, ISIS has just gone rampant and have taken control of the Middle East and Northern Africa. And they are invading Europe through Sicily, Spain, Croatia, and France. The places are significant because these are also the main regions in Europe that received refugees in 2015. And the fact that the game came out in 2016 in the aftermath of the refugee crisis is not fortuitous. I'm not going to read this quotation, so whoever is watching, you can pause the video and you can read it themselves. But when Vice News interviewed Jaroslav Zielensky, who is the CEO of Destructive Creations, he pretty much made a statement that he didn't trust that these refugees were simply refugees, and he suspected that they were ISIS terrorists among the refugees that arrived in Europe in 2015. And the game is coded to actually reflect this image of the refugees. So, for example, you see many of these ISIS terrorists arriving in dingy boats, not unlike those in which refugees were arriving in Europe in 2015. Of course, it is also coded to pander to many of the rhetoric that the right wing was using during this period. Several soldiers are suicide bombers with explosives attached to their bodies. They all have their faces covered to further dehumanize them. And if this was not enough, even the achievements are coded in these racist and medievalist ideas. So, for example, if you destroy 100 suicide bombers before they detonate themselves, you get an achievement called shish kebab. Or if you kill 30,000 terrorists, you get the John III Sobieski achievement. John III Sobieski was the Polish-Lithuanian king who defeated the Ottomans in the gates of Vienna in 1683. And if you complete the game, you get the Crusade complete achievement. So the message is very obvious, and the way in which the game is coded is pretty obvious, despite of what they say, which is why, on a first look, it's so surprising how they actually approach the Crusades. Because you would be justified in expecting them to actually kind of maybe glorify them or defend crusading in ancestors' legacy, but actually the game doesn't do that. The game unapologetically condemns the Crusades in the two campaigns that are dedicated to crusading. Now, these two campaigns is one around the Teutonic Order, which is the Prussian revolt against the Teutonic Knights in 1260 to 1274. And the other one is a campaign in which you play as Saladin and you have to retake Jerusalem in 1187. Now, the reason, of course, why it condemns the Crusades on a first look is because the narrative is being done through the eyes of the enemies of the crusade. So if you're playing as Saladin, of course, Saladin is the narrator, and you get the Muslim perspective as the game understands it, in which the crusades are heavily condemned. In the case of the Teutonic Knights, you play as the Teutonic Knights, but the narrative is made by a guy called Hercus Monte, who was the leader of the Prussian rebellion of 1260 to 1274. So the game is constantly the Crusades are constantly being condemned as barbaric, as hypocritical. The Crusaders are called bandits. For example, this is one of the images in the case of the Teutonic Knights, in which the violence of the Crusades are overly emphasized. So you see Teutonic Knights oppressing Prussian natives. Those who resisted were murdered and their families were forced into slavery. And even Western Crusaders kind of have the same rhetoric. If you see this image, right, this is from the last scenario in the Saladin campaign where you have to take Jerusalem. You infiltrate the city and you hear Crusaders talking. And one Crusader says, "I've had enough of this shit. If I make it out alive, I'm going to sail to Italy. A new life," they said. "A chance for salvation," they said. Horseshit. So there is like this very strong condemnation of crusading in the video game, which again, at first glance, it is surprising, considering not only how the far right normally uses crusading, but also the very record of destructive creations. Another element that reinforces this apparent condemnation of crusading, or this explicit, actually, condemnation of crusading, is that the game is relatively accurate in its portrayal of the events. Of course, with minor deviations due to narrative purposes mostly, but generally the events follow the chronological order that we have in our sources. For example, for the case of the Teutonic Knights, I actually suspect that they used primary sources, because Hercus Monte, the leader of the rebellion, is actually a rather obscure crusading figure outside of Poland and outside of Lithuania. There is a source written in the 13th century called the Chronicle of Prussia by Nicholas von Jeroshin, and the text that you see there is how he describes the death of Hercus Monte. But the fact that they're using this very obscure image, it kind of gives me the idea that they might be using this source. And I bring this quotation because the scenario in which you capture him is kind of similar, is very much inspired by the source, in which you have a small group of knights and you infiltrate a forest and you capture him and then you take him to your camp. Just that in the game, he's publicly executed instead of in the source that they say that they hanged him immediately. In any case, the thing is that, again, the events seem to be very much in line. So in the case of the Teutonic Knights, you go from the Battle of Pocarvis to the defeat at Lubao, to the fall of Christchurch, to the capture of Hercus Monte. And in the case of Saladin, you have the same. You have the Battle of Hattin, followed by the fall of Akka, followed by the fall of Ashkelon and the capture of Jerusalem. So the accuracy of the events would seem to point even to this, would highlight this criticism of crusading, which then we have something of a paradox here, or we're in an impasse. Because when we have this tendency of how the far right uses the Crusades and they see the Crusades, we see up the record of ancestors' legacy. And yet, the way in which they use crusading is through a total condemnation of the whole thing. So how can we reconcile this apparent paradox? And I think that the way to do it is to approach the game ludonarratively as a game, compare it to the other campaigns inside of the game, and pay special attention to the tone that the game uses when it actually approaches the Crusades. Now, to do this, we have to deviate a little bit and talk very quickly about historical game studies and what do we do when we approach history in video games. Video games today are the most important part of the entertainment industry. They outperform every other form of entertainment. Just in 2021, the entertainment industry made $192.7 billion, outperforming books, film entertainment, recorded music. The growth of the video game industry has also meant that many people today interact with history through video games. And many of the most important video game franchises are either inspired or set in historical scenarios, right? You have your Assassin's Creed, your Age of Empires, your Prince of Persia, your Call of Duties. This has also allowed for a growing of academic interest of what actually happens when video games simulate the past, because it's not the same as it happens with other forms of media. Mostly because what makes video games different from other forms of media is their interactivity. The player is not just an spectator. The player takes active action within the video game. He's an actual participant in history when they play a historical video game. Now, this interactivity, or the way in which video games work, is through an interconnection of interactivity, simulation, in understanding by simulation, the modeling of a source system through a different system which maintains some of the behaviors of the original. So think about a flight simulator, right? If you push down on the joystick, the plane goes up, very similar to what an actual plane lever would do, right? It keeps it's a simplification of an original system. And a set of rules that justify and give meaning to the behaviors within the simulation and allow for the immersion within the virtual world. These three elements combined is what makes video games a specific form of media different from movies, right? Now, the thing is that in the case of video games, we have a tenuous balance between this interactivity and this gameplay and the historical content that you are being shown in the screen. Because if we assume that a simulation simplifies, or as the definition says, is a modeling of a source system through a different system which maintains some of the behaviors of the original, when a game simulates history and calls itself historical, it's making some immediate epistemological claims about the truthfulness of its simulation, right? It is saying immediately this is based on something that we can to some extent call historically truthful. However, of course, the game has to make concessions because in the end, the main goal of the game is to entertain and to sell. And this is no secret. When Patrice Desilets, one of the main developers of Assassin's Creed 2, was interviewed in 2019, and he was asked this question about gameplay, fun, and history, he answered, the official answer is, fun is always first. But sometimes historical matters will bring you fun also. I like to say that histories are licensed, so yes, we can take some liberties, but not too much. Otherwise, what's the point? Pretty much highlighting this tenuous tension between fun, gameplay, and history. And this is something that we also see in the perception by players. There is a very good study by Sterling and Wood, in which they made a survey of many, I think it was like 500 students in their university. And the reaction that they got was pretty much this idea. Yes, historical accuracy is important, but if they had to choose between historical accuracy and fun, they would actually rather that the developers game went for gameplay, because in the end, we're talking about a game. So we have a tension here, because simulation implies truthfulness, whereas a truthfulness that is also always mediated by the needs of the medium. So what is like the limit? Where is like the limit between this accuracy and this gameplay? And then a category that is very useful for this is the idea of historical authenticity. Because games do not try to judge a video game for its accuracy is missing the point, because the interest of the game is not to be accurate, it's to be fun. However, authenticity is different from accuracy. It's related to it, but it's difficult to define because are these ingrained images and ideas that we have about the past that are reproduced academically, but mostly through media and popular culture. Helen Young says the following about authenticity, and I'm going to read it because I think it's a very good point. She says, historical authenticity has little to do with verifiable fact, even though it is predicated as a concept on existence of an objective and knowable historical truth. It is a discourse that circulates through processes of production and consumption to manage anachronisms and inventions at the constraints of form, genre, and audience's expectations, resulting in representation that is quote-unquote historical in the sense that it has the character of history. It is socially and culturally constructed, but also widely understood as objectively true. Now, I like what she says here because it's not unlike medievalisms. When we talk about the Middle Ages, it's very similar. Many of the ideas that we have about the Middle Ages are not objectively historical fact, but they are medieval because that is the way in which we have come to perceive the period. And a great example of this is Braveheart, because we all know how inaccurate Braveheart is, mostly in its depiction of the Scots, but its image was so prevalent and so impactful at the moment that even video games adopted it as the authentic way of representing the Scots in their games. Age of Empires 2 did it in 1999, and Medieval 2 Total War did it in 2006. So historical authenticity is sometimes more useful to understand because games are not necessarily being accurate, but they do sell themselves as authentic. Authenticity that sells itself as neutral, but is never neutral. And another great example of this is what Mark Lamia, the head of Treyarch Studio in 2008, answered when he was asked about why in Call of Duty World at War, a game from 2008, did not include the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And what he answered is the following. There's not much gameplay associated with that, the dropping of the atomic bomb, and that's something that we never tried to focus on. We are making a game. We're not making a political statement. What we try to do as we strive for authenticity is, well, that was part of the war. The Imperial Japanese were different than the current people who run the country. And to sanitize that situation, to actually not show that they had this honor and code that these soldiers fought with would have been a dishonor. We just tried to tell a story about a part of the war that actually happened. The fact that he says that not choosing to put the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is not making a political statement is baffling, because just by choosing not to put it, you're making a political statement. You're choosing which version of the war to actually sell. And this is how authenticity works. Authenticity sells itself as objective, as accepted, but it's never neutral. It is always guided by our ideas of the past that are more often than not politically motivated. So that's one key idea to keep in mind. Another key idea to keep in mind before we go back to the actual question is how do video games communicate historical arguments? Games are ludonarrative. It's a ludonarrative form of media, meaning the narrative that emerges in the interaction between narrative and gameplay. And for this, a great concept is procedural rhetoric, which is the argument that comes from a game by its rules and the interaction of the rules with the actions of the player. So to give you a very clear example of procedural rhetoric is what South Park in a game that is called South Park, The Fractured But Whole, how they actually manage the difficulty level, because I think is very poignant. So I'm going to, it's a 30 seconds video, but I'm going to play it.
Don't worry, this doesn't affect combat, just every other aspect of your whole life.
Right? Now, you can agree or not agree with their argument, but in the way in which they are using the difficulty level, by making it very difficult if you're an African American, they are making an argument about race relations in the United States. And this is how procedural rhetoric works. It is what the game asks you to do, what it doesn't allow you to do, and what the rules motivate and they punish. That's how video games communicate their arguments. Of course, not all video games communicate the same type of arguments. It depends a lot on the simulation. So, for example, if you have a game like Assassin's Creed, what Adam Chapman calls a realist or reconstructionist simulation, the type of argument is very different. These games are called realist, not because they are realist in their objectivity, but because of the detail of the realism of the reconstruction of the simulation, right? So they focus on these little details, the buildings, the clothes, the sounds. Call of Duty works like this. In these type of games, history is understood as a collection of personal experiences, but history is also a closed issue. You cannot alter the way in which history develops. If you play Call of Duty, Germany is always going to lose the war at the end of 1945. You cannot alter the development of history. You play a key role in it, and history is presented as in a presentist state, as happening at the same time that you're experiencing it, but you cannot change history. Of course, this means that the type of arguments that these type of video games are best equipped to offer are micro-historical arguments. The daily activities, how to attack a trench, how people live the daily life and such. On the other hand, you have other types of games, like, for example, Civilization, which is a different type of historical simulation, what Chapman also calls conceptual or constructionist. In this type of games, it is called conceptual because the reconstruction is abstract, right? You have a map or a tabletop kind of form of board. In Civilization is like this, right? Like that type of checkboard type of map. And instead of focusing on specific characters and events, it focuses on macro social dynamics. So in Civilization, you have to develop a whole civilization from the Stone Age until a near futuristic era. You collect resources and you engage in diplomacy and you develop technologies. And the whole historical reconstruction is not about the events, it's about these social dynamics, a type like the School of the Annals in France, right? This long history type of approach. Of course, in these type of games, the player has a lot more freedom to actually alter the historical development because the events are not important. It is the macro social dynamics that are important. So in Civilization, you can play as the Sumerians, defeat the Americans in a war and colonize Mars. Because the point is not about the event. That's why it's also called a constructionist simulation, because you are part of the construction of the narrative in something that we call emergent narratives, a historical narrative that emerges as you play the game and as you alter the game. So, keeping all of this in mind, what does Ancestors Legacy actually say about the Crusades? The first thing to keep in mind is that although Ancestors Legacy lies somewhere in the middle, it is a strategy game, so it would be initially more related to conceptualism or simulations. It actually reflects more a realist type because the scenarios are very much driven in one direction, and you cannot alter the result of these scenarios. Even to some extent, in some of the scenarios that you play in this game, the hand-holding is massive. Like sometimes you don't have much freedom. So, for example, in this scenario that you're seeing in the slide, in the last one in which you have to capture Jerusalem as you play as Saladin, the game from the beginning gives you an army, tells you what to recruit, then you have to defend your camp, then you have to recruit some ballista, then it's very much guided by the hand. So you don't have much freedom to actually alter the events. This also means that in Ancestors Legacy, the past and its interpretation is a closed issue. It is as the game is portraying it to you. It doesn't have the ability to imagine other forms of historical past. Now, it is also useful to compare it to other forms of titles that are similar. Because, for example, if you compare it to Age of Empires, which is also a real-time strategy game, Ancestors' Legacy is a game strictly about violence and about war. You cannot recruit any units that are not soldiers. You cannot develop any technologies that is not military technologies. I think with the exception of the religious building, all the buildings are military buildings. And the resources are, you capture a village and the villagers immediately recollect, they gather the resources for you. So in Ancestors' Legacy, these are Middle Ages that are centered about war and about conflict. Conflict that becomes its most gruesome when different faiths meet one another, be it Christians against Muslims or be it Vikings against Christians. But it's a game strictly about military affairs. Also because there is no other way of winning a match if it is not through military means. In Civilization, you can win scientific victories or religious victories. And in Age of Empires, there also you can, if you build a wonder and you defend it, you can have a type of cultural victory. There is still also a prioritized war, but this is a game that is strictly about war. And that is also, again, the game doesn't allow you to engage with the Middle Ages in other ways. This is a medieval past that does not highlight any form of civil or intellectual achievements. This overemphasis on warfare also means that there is a hyper-masculine form of Middle Ages. Women are technically invisible in this game. Again, you cannot recruit female units, not even civilians, because you cannot recruit civilians. Women, when they appear, they are either the victims of war or they are political tokens for the marriages of great kings and great warriors. And of course, they also idealize the hyper-masculine soldier, as in most clearly in the case of the Vikings. And as you can see in the art, these are images taken from the art book of the game. Despite the fact that the Middle Ages have some of the most famous female rulers, like Isabella of England, or Eleanor of Aquitaine, of Queen Melisende of Jerusalem, or Empress Irene of Byzantium. The thing is that even just because the game is about war doesn't mean that they could not have used these cases. To give you an example, when you play the Edward the Confessor campaign, for most of the time you don't play as Edward, you play as other people. So there was no reason, for example, to use the civil war between Baldwin III and Queen Melisende in the Kingdom of Jerusalem and do something similar. But there is a game in which women are almost never present. And it's, again, a very masculine, a very violent type of Middle Ages, the one that they actually prioritize. And the case of the Vikings, and again, I'm bringing it because comparing it with other types of campaigns also brings light into why they show the Crusades as the way they show it, which I am going to get in a minute. The case of the Vikings is important because, again, interreligious fighting is when violence gets the most gruesome in Ancestors' Legacy. Now, Christianity is portrayed in an interesting way because it is portrayed in one of three ways. It is either shown as hypocritical and barbaric, as the case when crusading violence is being condemned. It is never shown as factually, like materially truthful, in the case, for example, as Viking religion is. When you play the campaign about Rurik I, the whole campaign is narrated by a guy called Vidar, a seer or a prophet, and all his visions come true. He envisions Rurik as the first ruler of the Kievan Rus, and that happens. He envisions his brothers trying to kill him, and that also happens. He envisions Rurik's death at the end, and that also happens. Christianity never has this element of truthfulness that Viking religion has. But Christianity is also debilitating and disgusting, and it's mostly it's degenerate / debilitating. Edward the Confessor is low-key mocked for praying instead of laying down with his wife or his lovers. The monks and Lidesfjorn are shown as fat and disgusting, which of course is supposed to compare to the super masculine, fit Viking warrior. The contrast is very obvious. But, and this is the other thing that is interesting, it is also something of a mark of civilization. And this happens in the case of the campaign of Mieszko I, king of Poland. Now, this would seem contradictory, but not necessarily. The thing is that many of the members of destructive creations, they actually are members of neo-paganist, Odinist type of groups that they both condemn Christianity in this expansive fashion, which the Crusades fall into it, while still preferring it to other civilizations like the Muslim one. So it is not completely contradictory. So what does this mean for the way in which the game portrays crusading? Yeah, crusading is condemned, true. But the way in which crusading is portrayed is as a civilizational conflict in which no reconciliation can ever be possible, which is pretty much also how the far right understands today relations between the West and non-Muslim and the Muslim societies, right? Crusading is constantly being presented in either terms of national struggle or in terms of civilizational and racial struggle. In the case of the Teutonic Knights, it is shown as a national struggle, also probably because it makes part of a longer tradition which sees the Teutonic Knights as the first German invasion of the East. The film Alexander Nevsky, the 1938 film, did the same thing. And also because it was a king of Poland who defeated the Teutonic Knights in 1410. But again, the Crusades here are being portrayed in a strictly modern term. It is that the campaign says the Teutonic Knights are trying to found a nation, which a military order trying to found a nation, like it really doesn't work. It is really most present in the case of the Saladin campaign. And there's another thing that I forgot to mention. There is also a Middle Ages that is racially homogeneous, because when the game first came out in 2018, neither the Teutonic Knights nor the Saladin campaign made part of the game. All of the campaigns, all the other ones were just about white European kingdoms, ignoring every other type of non-white groups present in this period that we know were there. And the only non-white group that appears is the case of the Arabs. And when the Arabs appear, they appear as opposition to the West, again, in this civilizational discourse of the whole thing. And this is very much present in the Saladin campaign. When you read medieval sources, the word Arab never comes into place. Muslims are either called Turks or they are called Saracens. But in the campaign, more often than not, they are actually called Arabs. Because what the game does, it also puts Muslims and Islam into this larger umbrella and everything is the same. So for example, when you're fighting the last scenario to conquer Jerusalem, your camp is going to be attacked at night, sabotaged by night. And suddenly they realize that these are assassins, the Shiites sect of the 12th century. And when they discover this, Spearman shouts, "Wait, what? Assassins? But they are Arabian soldiers. What would they serve these infidels?" And another soldier answers them that they have become corrupt and they have betrayed their faith. Of course, because this is a game that cannot imagine internal conflicts between the Muslims, because they are all the same. Even if famously the assassins tried to kill Saladin twice. They tried to assassinate him twice. Nowhere is this more present than in the very representation of Saladin in the game. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole tradition, but basically Saladin has this fame since the Middle Ages of being this chivalrous, just, merciful type of ruler. And if you see the model of the avatar, he's very much inspired by the Saladin of Kingdom of Heaven. But that's where the inspiration ends in the physical, because the Saladin of Ancestors Legacy is obsessed with jihad. He's obsessed with killing every single Christian that does not become a Muslim. We know by our sources that Saladin never breached the walls of Jerusalem, but in the game you actually have to breach Jerusalem, and you only negotiate with Valiant of Evil in the surrender of the city when you reach the citadel. And when you reach the citadel, pretty much Valiant of Evil has to convince Saladin to stop killing Christians, so he would not destroy the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's actually funny because at the end of the game, when you actually finish the campaign, so Saladin agrees to allow Christians to leave the city, but his mercy is really just another form of execution, because what the game implies in the ending cinematic is that these Christians are thrown into the desert to die of thirst. And in the end, he says, "This is the will of Allah, may his peace be with us." And in the back of Saladin, there is a map of Europe, and you see blood spots going from the south to the north, from northern Africa into Europe, like maybe suggesting an invasion of Islam of Europe. Again, it's all very same. So although, and I want to conclude with this, so although at first hand, the game seems to condemn crusading, and is rather accurate in the portrayal of the events, when you actually see beneath this superficial accuracy, you actually see what the game is saying about the Middle Ages, which is not contradictory of what we know other far right-wing groups say about the Middle Ages, and say even about crusading. And in this, I want to finish with something, and is a concept called the tyranny of realism, which is a concept brought by an author called Adrian Shaw. And in her paper about Assassin's Creed, she says that the problem sometimes with video games is that in our attempt to be accurate, or in their attempt to be accurate, we keep using sources that only reflect hegemonical points of views. And this is clearly what happens with Ancestors' Legacy. Its superficial accuracy ends up conveying a very untruthful message about crusading, about West and Eastern relations, and a very biased and a very inaccurate itself understanding of what crusading is in the end, which makes me wonder, what if maybe accuracy is not the whole point of all of this? What about in order to create empathetic memories of because sometimes empathetic memories of the past imply going beyond the sources, because we know very little about how most of the people live in the past. Now, this can be dangerous. I'm not going to say no, because when you ignore your sources, it can give place to revisionist, racist, and dangerous historical interpretations. But I also think that if we do not apply our own imagination to an approach of the past, mostly in a medium that is interactive and that has strong emotional elements, well, if we actually use those types of approaches to history, maybe we can use history in a better way, in a context in which we see the medieval past being increasingly weaponized for political agendas. And that's where I want to end. Oh, I took a little bit longer than I expected, but yeah, I'm gonna leave it there.
No worries at all. Thanks very much, Juan. That was such a fascinating discussion that I think covered so many really interesting topics, from both the kind of opportunities and challenges that video games pose to certainly this extraordinary, and dare I say rather awful, interpretation of the Crusades. As somebody who has come to specialize in Islamic history, I will admit a part of me did slightly die inside as I sort of learned about Saladin's conquest.
Right.
So I suppose the first question, I'd like to perhaps pick up on sort of the last point that you made there about sort of being able to combine empathy with obviously staying true to one's sources.
Right.
And perhaps, just if anything, to restore my faith that we can depict the Crusades, in a fairer way in gaming. Do you think that there are any games that portray the Crusades in a slightly better light? And if so, what do you think they get right where perhaps Ancestor Legacy kind of fails at that?
Right. I mean, the thing is that, I focus on the case of the Crusades because I find them interesting when you approach it through media, right? They are what I call a mid-polemical historical topic. They're very polemical today for their political implications, but they are not as polemical to the fact that you cannot play with them, right? It's not the Holocaust. You cannot play with the Holocaust. You cannot play with slavery, but you can play with the Crusades. The thing with the Crusades, and this is the problem that I have seen in most of the games that they approach it, and this is part of the thing that I was saying at the end, is that they take them for granted, right? When you take a game like Assassin's Creed or like Age of Empires, even the games that approach them better, like Crusader Kings, which is a game that focuses on the mechanics of crusading, so like on the recruitment and on the grand strategy and feudal relations. Again, it's a type of constructionist game. For those who have played Crusader Kings, I think they know more what I mean, that I can actually explain it in words in a short time. But the thing is that none of these games actually ask the question why the Crusades happened or what were the Crusades. They're just taking them as granted, which kind of makes sense, right? If you're going to have a historical video game and the game is going to be accurate and it's a historical video game about the Middle Ages, it would be weird if the Crusades were not there. But this makes me wonder, what maybe if the whole point is that the Crusades didn't have to happen? Because when we assume that they had to happen, it's very easy to fall into these civilizational conflict narratives. The West and Islam have always been at war, and it is always going to be like this, and reconciliation and dialogues are impossible to achieve. So sometimes what I think is like, what if we had a game in which the whole point of the game is the Crusades not happening, preventing the Crusades from happening? Because if you have that type of game, then the whole mechanic is engaging on the reasons of why they happen. I don't know if I'm making myself clear. Of course, there are games that are more responsible in the way in which they approach crusading. Ancestors' legacy, beneath its superficial accuracy, is just a repetition of the civilizational conflict narrative. But this is something that you also see in many other games. Crusader Kings is the one game that I would maybe say does it the best, but because it is a game that focuses on social dynamics and not on events. But even Crusader Kings does not deal with the question why the Crusades happen. And that is really the issue that I have found with this game. They just take them for granted. And because they take them for granted, there's no need to explore them. You just engage with them, but you explain the reasons. It's just how they happen, not why they happen.
Absolutely. I think that's a really fascinating interpretation, because I guess the issue that if you just assume that it was just a granted teleological thing that was bound to happen any old way, you don't sort of get into the meat of, the causes and the consequences. And I think in many ways, the really interesting stuff about what drove and shaped these conflicts. And I know what you mean. I think it ties back, as you said, into sort of ancestors' legacy in the way that it assumes that the narrative is fixed, that there's no way to kind of challenge or prod at it or poke at it in any way. So To
give you another example that comes to mind is Age of Empires, because Age of Empires has a Saladin campaign that is very different from the Ancestors' Legacy one. The Saladin campaign in Age of Empires, although it falls again on this idea of the hypocritical crusader, is this noble Saladin, just, merciful, whatever, right? But Age of Empires also has an in-game encyclopedia. And when you read the Crusades entry there, it only mentions the Crusades against the Saracens, which is the other thing. The Crusades were not only against Islam. It is not a civilizational conflict. There were Crusades against Cathar heretics. There were Crusades against the German emperor in Italy. There were Crusades against pagans. Well, the Ancestors' Legacy does talk about the Crusades in the Baltic. The Crusades, more than a civilizational conflict against Islam, was a whole part of medieval Christianity in the way in which the papacy redefined itself in the 11th century and forwards. But even this type of Age of Empires, for example, ignores it, which again perpetuates the idea of Crusades, civilizational conflict, East versus West, right?
Absolutely. It's sort of, I know what you mean. It keeps those sort of long-held tropes in place without actually, understanding that in many ways it was a case of cause and consequence, and there are all sorts of really complicated and interesting factors that build up to it. So I think, as anybody who studied the Crusades will know all too well. That's pretty fascinating. Thank you so much. Before I hog too much of the Q&A, I'd like to pass over to Nuno, who would like to ask a question.
Good night, Mr. Juan. I have a question that might be out of topic, but this question happened to me. So my question is, George R.R. Martin uses actual events and locations in history and adopts this to his own world. This is inside the topic or is outside?
I mean, the way in which George R.R. Martin uses the Middle Ages. Yeah, I mean, what I would say about George R.R. Martin's interpretation of the Middle Ages is that it follows many of the same medievalist ideas that we have. And it is going to sound like a broken record, but for example, let me put it this way. I remember this case when Game of Thrones, I think it was like season 4, there was this very polemical scene in which Jaime rapes in the septon over like the body of their dead child, right? And when there was some outrage about this scene, the main response was, that's how it was in the Middle Ages. And the question is like, is that how it was in the Middle Ages? Because again, what is your historical evidence for these type of things? To give you another example, which I think is fantastic, and is the case of The Witcher 3. I don't know if you know the video game, The Witcher. Well, you know the series that now Netflix is doing. Well, when The Witcher 3, the video game, came out in 2016, I think it was, a scholar by the last name of Brandenburg, she wrote a very good piece on how people reacted to the game. And in one of the reviews, they said that the game is amazing, but they had some problems with the fact that, again, that there were no white people in these Middle Ages, although we know that there were Pechenegs, that we know that there were Black peoples in Europe, in Southern Italy, they knew about the Muslim, we know all these kind of things. And their treatment of women in the game. And one of the comments of these reviews said something like, the game is set like in 1250, and at the time Europeans didn't know about other ethnic groups, and that's how the Middle Ages were. Which brings to fact two elements. First, we know that that's factually not true. And second, why are you using history to justify representation in a fantasy game? Because in the end, it's fantasy. Like, it doesn't have to attach itself to any form of historical setting. I mean, this has dragons and griffins and magic, but it cannot have a Black person, right? So for what I would say for the case of George R.R. Martin and these other games is that, again, is this idea of the Middle Ages as this place of alterity, right? When they said that is how the Middle Ages were, it's because the Middle Ages were this barbaric type of period in which women are raped in churches. And the assumption is that it is that dark moment that we have supposedly already overcome. Again, this moment in the past in which the things that we assume are not present in our society is to be reflected. Now, of course, George R.R. Martin, we know, used a lot of actually historical elements. The War of the Roses was an inspiration for his whole story. We know that the Church of the Seven is pretty much Christianity, not only in the structure of the clergy, but also the seven that is in one is like the Trinity, which is 3 in 1. The Lord of Light, the religion of the Lord of Light is a Manichaean type of religion, like the one that the Cathars had about Christianity and all this kind of stuff. But like in Ancestors' Legacy, sometimes the interesting thing is not what they get right. It's more like the tone that they put on the thing that they get right, and most importantly, what is the thing that they ignore? Because sometimes, like when in history, sometimes it's more important to question what is the historian, what is he not telling you? What are they not telling you? And why are they not telling you that? And with the world of George R.R. Martin, I would claim the same. Why does he choose, of all the possible Middle Ages, what did he choose that one? The greedy, violent type of Middle Ages.
Thank you for your answer, Professor. I will pass to my colleague, Peter. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And I think just to round off tonight's discussion with sort of one final question. I think it's very interesting whether we've discussed some of the issues that video games can have with the narrative that they present and the way that they can set certain interpretations in stone. But perhaps just to broaden out the conversation and to go back to a lot of your work with video games and their role in history, what opportunities do you think they can potentially provide in terms of historical education? And I think you've probably already picked up on this quite a lot already, but just to kind of conclude and round off the talk, where do you think they really need to go in order to be better? Right.
So the first thing that I would like to clarify is that despite my rant, this is not a thing against video games. I love video games. I play video games all the time. I love historical video games. They're a key part of my hobbies and one of the reasons why I'm actually a historian, right? On the one hand, you have video games that are properly educational, that are created for that. But I don't want to talk about those because those are like the games that are actually dedicated for this. I will say two things. One, I want to bring an example, and there's this studio in Germany called Paint Bucket Studios, and they make very good games about World War II, in which they bring a whole approach to World War II that is not your typical soldier fantasy. They have a game, for example, that is called Through the Darkest of Times, in which you play as a resistance group inside of Berlin, inside of Nazi Germany, civilian resistance, in which the center of the whole thing is how normal people lived and what did it actually mean to be a Nazi in this period. Because think about a game like Call of Duty. When have you seen in Call of Duty, when have you seen the Nazis do Nazi stuff? You never see that in Call of Duty, which begs the question, can you actually have an actual authentic experience of the Second World War when you don't deal with the horrors of the war? Probably not. So I would encourage people to look at these games because the whole gameplay mechanic is outside of the traditional power fantasy, which is the problem that I many times see with these video games. But beyond that, and this is the thing that I really think about video games, is that the problem that we have with history and the problem that we have with the past is that we cannot experience it in the way, for example, that we can experience biology. We can go into a lab, run an experiment, and experience the experiment and say something about it. History, we cannot do this by the simple fact that we cannot travel in time, right? However, and this is difficult to put it into words, and even if any of you have played video games, maybe you will be able to understand them. But video games are emotional as all form of art is very emotional. I don't know, The Legend of Zelda is my favorite historical video game series, and the last time I finished the last one, Breath of the Wild, what I felt at the end of the game is difficult to put it into words. And I think this is something that we could use rhetorically to teach history, because it's a type of emotional and experiential approach to the past that is very hard to replicate through other means, like the written word. Now, how to do that, I don't know, to be honest. I mean, I'm just researching this. I'm not a game developer. I would love to work with developers, but I think that's where like the real value of historical video games somewhere lie, that they can give us this type of empathic, emotional, experiential approach to the past that we cannot get somewhere else. And I think that's the real valuable stuff, because, and I want to finish with this, I understand political radicalization and the use of history for political radicalization mostly as a pedagogical problem. How do we teach and how do we learn history? Just telling somebody your facts are wrong and I'm going to tell you why your facts are wrong have never de-radicalized anyone. It is a rhetorical problem on how we communicate this. Cicero used to say that if you wanted to convince someone, it's about their emotions. And I think this is where, if we want to use history to de-radicalize people, I think this is where video games can be very useful, because they do appeal to your emotions when you're playing, because you are there. That's what I would say.
That's fantastic. I honestly couldn't put that better myself. And I think that's a fantastic way to finish what has been an absolutely incredible discussion. Juan, thank you so much for your time this evening. This has been such an incredible discussion. It's been a real pleasure to have you with us.
Yeah, thank you for your invitation. And this has been really a pleasure.
Absolutely. Likewise. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks for everybody watching, and hope to see you in the next episode. Take care. Bye.